In a world where you can harness soul magic to find the origin of your soul and the ones who created it, the gods can keep very little secrets. What secrets lay in Eora, and what can we learn about the gods who inhabit it? Find out in today's episode about the gods of the Pillars of Eternity and Avowed universe. Hey there, welcome to the Lord to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I want to talk about something that has been living rent-free in my head for the last couple of weeks, and that is Avowed. Specifically, some of the lore behind the series, because if you didn't know, this game is actually a successor to the Pillars of Eternity games, taking place a few years after the second game. I would hazard to say that Avowed is a modern reimagining of the series and likely the direction that the series will take going forward. And since it's been causing such a buzz on the internet lately, and I have been fortunate enough to play it, I wanted to talk about it today. But before we get started, I want to ask that you rate this podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening to it, or like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. The only way that I know that you're enjoying the content that I'm making is if you let me know. So rate the show, leave a comment, or send an email to lordtodeath@gmail.com to suggest an episode or just say hey. So with that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. And today I wanted to talk about the gods or deities of Eora, the world that Pillars of Eternity and Avowed is set in. To talk about these deities, we're going to have to risk entering spoiler territory for all of these games. These deities and their stories are linked directly to the story of the games, especially Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. So it's hard to talk about them without getting into the nitty-gritty of it all. If you haven't played the Pillars of Eternity games and don't want to spoil yourself for the story, then here's your chance to turn away. If you haven't played Avowed, this story should be relatively spoiler-free for you. I'm not going to talk about anything that happens in the story other than the main character and the basic premise, which you learn in the prologue of the game. I will mention a couple of names here and there throughout the episode, but if you haven't played the game, they're not going to make any sense to you, and it's not really going to ruin your experience of the game. So, if you haven't played Pillars of Eternity, then I would suggest that maybe you go and play those games, come back. Or if you just want a refresher on the lore, or don't want to play the Pillars of Eternity games before playing Avowed, then this is a great episode for you. So there it is. There's your spoiler warning. And now we can get on with the episode. In Eora, there exist 12 deities that we know of. And these deities are real beings that physically existed in the realms at one point or still do physically exist. So their existence couldn't really be denied and therefore were worshipped by basically everyone under the sun. These deities currently exist in a realm called the Beyond, or at least most of them do, which is a metaphysical realm where souls go after they die before they are reincarnated into the next world. So it's almost like a purgatory of sorts. I think that the main reason that they exist in the Beyond instead of being down in Eora physically was because they understood the power that they controlled and thought that it would be too disruptive to Kith civilizations in Eora. And so they decided to exist in a realm where they could not physically intervene with the going on of the physical world unless it was absolutely necessary to save it from total destruction, or they had some sort of vested self-interest in what was happening. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves, and I just want to explain one term before we go on, and that is one that I just said, which is Kith. If you're not familiar with the games, Kith is what sentient races in this universe are called. So in Eora, you have your humans, elves, dwarves, etc. There are many different races, and Kith refers to all of them. It's kind of like saying mankind in a way, but whenever I say Kith, I am referring to the sentient beings living in Eora, or at least the humanoid beings living in Eora. So I just wanted to clear that up before we go ahead. And I think that the next reasonable step before talking about them too much further is to introduce these gods and talk about where they came from and how they ended up in the Beyond. And so in alphabetical order, we have Abaddon, god of crafting and the forge, and patron of the Knights of the Crucible. Berath, god of cycles, doors, and death. Eothas, god of light and redemption. Galawain, god of the hunt in all of its forms. Hylia, goddess of birds and the sky. Magran, goddess of fire and war. Andra, goddess of water and the moon. Rimmergand, god of death, famine, plague, or simply bad luck. Sapadal, goddess of the living lands, known as the gardener. Skane, god of secret hatred, resentment, and violent rebellion. Whale, god of dreams, secrets, mysteries, and revelations. And Wodaka, goddess of law, memory, rightful rulership, and vengeance. 12 deities, all filling their different roles for the Kith in Eora. Very similarly to the Greek pantheon, people were aware of and respected the existence of all of these deities. Most Kith chose to primarily worship the deity or deities that fit their lifestyle the most. So, a blacksmith might worship Abaddon, or a hunter would likely pray to Galawain, or a farmer might choose Andra or Eothas. It really depended on your own personal values, and you weren't limited to one or the other. And I think that makes for a very interesting pantheon. And just like any other religion, people chose to worship in many different ways, but there is a central theme that most people live their lives by, and that is reincarnation. A devout priest would show their devotion by leading sermons or praying to their deity on a daily basis to gain favor, as you might typically think of religious worship. Others might choose to show their faith through traditions and physical toil, like the farmers, using that example again, tending to their crops and selling them at the marketplace as a means to sustain others, and as a way of showing their deities respect. Both of these groups would be doing this in the hopes that, when they die, their soul is treated with respect by their deity and given a good hand in the next life due to their hard work in their previous life. Then there are those who strictly work out of karmic self-interest, who think of the gods or worship a deity that fits their chaotic lifestyle, like the god of secret hatred and resentment Skane, or Magran, the god of war, and hope that being a general piece of shit is good enough to appease the deity and allow them to be reincarnated. So, really, the worship of any god is just to appease to one of the values of the gods. And then that god would probably take some sort of interest in you, or at the very least, approve of your lifestyle. And clearly there are very many different ways to do that. I feel like the only real way to have the gods shun your soul is to be entirely atheistic, which there really isn't much of that in this universe. Because the gods were physically present, you know that they existed. It's hard to deny them, and it's hard to not believe in them. But to not worship in some way is to risk not being reincarnated, which is why I would wager that most, if not all, Kith worship a deity in some way, whether it be true worship or just a passing nod as they're stabbing someone in the back for cheating them in a game of dice. To not be reincarnated means to float aimlessly for eternity in the beyond, which is a fate worse than simply being reincarnated as something worse than a dung beetle. But reincarnation wasn't strictly handled by the gods. The gods did pick and choose some souls to throw into bodies, but for the most part, it was dealt with by soul lottery. So basically, your soul's going to hang out in this purgatory in the beyond for a while, and then eventually when a new body is created, you'll get in there at some point via the lottery. This could take years. It could take a long time. And that's why you would worship the gods, because if you had particular favor with a god, then they could fast track that process. Because as far as we know, your soul is aware that it is in the beyond. You won't remember that in your next life, but if you're floating in the beyond for a millennia, you'll know it, and that is a torture. So all of this is to say that worship is very important for the people of Eora, to make sure that their soul is kept nicely in the afterlife, or rather it's taken care of in the afterlife, before it's put into a new body. But Where did they come from? How are the deities able to choose who goes into the next life and when? And I've mentioned a couple times that the deities were able to physically walk the world at one point, and if they were physically there, then they must have been born of something. So, did they start the world, or did they simply come to exist in it? And this is one of those things where I'm going to say it's a bit of column A and it's a bit of column B. They were instrumental in shaping Eora as we know it, but there's a reason why I keep saying deity instead of God sometimes, and I think that's a personal preference to distinguish that the deities of this world are not gods in the traditional sense because they were created by people, not the other way around. And I just want to let that sink in for a second that the gods were created by people. The Engwithans were an ancient society who had mastered animancy, or soul magic, to the point where they were able to essentially create gods out of ideals. And I know that is a crazy concept, so let's take a moment to learn about the Engwithans and how it all happened. Unfortunately, being an ancient story, there were plenty of gaps in our understanding of how their society functioned, and most of their story has been lost to ages, due to even the most knowledgeable scholars not being able to decipher their ancient scripts. So, because of this, much that we know about the Engwithans has been steeped in rumor and folklore, rather than fact. However, enough is understood that we have a broad idea of certain events. So, if some of these concepts seem a little half-assed, that's why. Many refer to the Engwithans as the builders for their structures that were built using living Adra as pillars that were larger than life and more elaborate than even most modern buildings. And I'm just going to take a pause again to explain Adra really quickly. Adra is a crystalline structure, green in appearance and almost translucent. And it's very easy to carve and manipulate, which makes it a favorite of jewelers. But it's more than just a jewel, in that it has a unique property that binds itself to the soul, and it acts as a conduit for souls both capable of storing and transporting them over vast distances. So, using the right technology and animancy or soul magic, Adra can be used to manipulate souls. And simply, Adra is what leads souls into the beyond so that they can be reincarnated. Anyways, back to the Engwithans, we start to get an understanding of their society as one that was splintered into several groups that were ruled by wealthy tyrants. These tyrants would lord over their subjects with absolute power and wealth, both of which were used to keep them in power indefinitely, or at least until their deaths. It seems like these societies of this time had their own religions that were unrelated to modern theistic beliefs. Each civilization was said to worship its own set of gods, and when you have rules under tyrants who have different political and theistic beliefs, warfare was commonplace. And specifically, religious warfare. I mentioned themes of reincarnation were strong in the modern pantheon, but at this time it wasn't necessarily a guarantee that if you lived a life in service to the gods, that you would come back in another life. In fact, there was no guarantee that the gods that they worship even existed in the first place. Unlike the modern deities, the gods that the Engwithans and other societies in Eora worshipped weren't existent beings, but rather were based on mythology, and largely led by faith. And that's all to say that there wasn't a system that was understood by the Engwithan gods that would allow for reincarnation. And that might seem like a really strange thing to bring up and hyperfixate on reincarnation, but in the case of Ard-Nua, one of these Engwithan tyrants, it was a staple of his drive for innovation. It was said that he was actually a just and fair ruler, which seems uncharacteristic of these supposed tyrants of the time, but maybe he was just good by comparison. However subjectively good he was, his mood shifted after the death of his son, Maros, who was made to be a warrior by his father and found only death on the battlefield. Maros' death caused Ard-Nua to go mad, and this is because of the uncertainty of death. He loved his son dearly and wished for his soul to be returned to its body, but this wasn't seen as being possible. And so, in his madness, Ard-Nua strived to create machines and invest in soul magic, essentially in an effort to seize his son's soul from the beyond and bring it back to this world. One of the ways that he attempted this was by creating a massive statue out of living Adra to house Maros' soul. In this process, he had to essentially send countless souls into a meat grinder in trial and error to see what worked. This was an absolutely barbaric act that was as of yet unheard of in this world, as many Anguithans were tortured and killed for the sake of furthering animancy to gain a better understanding of the soul, where it went, and how one could bring it back. And I don't need to explain the irony that is killing hundreds, if not thousands of people to return one soul, but that is invested self-interest for you. They did end up producing the intended results, though. Eventually, an animancer named Kabiros and his gang came to the understanding as to where Maros' soul was, and, in turn, came to a new understanding of the interstice between life and death, and all of the atrocities that they had committed to this point was deemed a worthwhile sacrifice for science. This is when they began constructing the statue that would hold Maros' soul for reincarnation. Basically, through their tortures, they learned at which point a soul would shatter when pushed too hard, and they were able to use that pressure to bind a soul to a vessel, essentially inventing a form of immortality. However, this was not perfect. Kabiros was so confident in his theory that he performed the procedure on himself, which was successful, but with the drawback that, while the soul was immortal, the body would still be in a state of decay just like any other person. And what good is an immortal soul if the body's going to break down at the same rate as anyone else? And so Kabiros came to the understanding that he needed to feed on living Adra or other people in order to keep his body going and keeping from dying. Of course, since he had done this to himself and he was also the leader of the project that was going to bring Maros' soul back, he ended up becoming distracted from his main goal given to him by Adnua, and instead was more focused on his own immortality, and I think that makes sense. However, of course, Adnua was not happy with this. Anything that was delaying his reunion with his son was unacceptable. After all, he had sacrificed everything that he had and everything that his subjects had to keep this experiment going, and it was far from done. There was plenty of work that needed to be done still, so Adnua found a group of 3 Animancer sisters who would complete the job for him. These sisters formed a cult around Adnua's teachings and were known as the Children of the Wheel, and they were looked upon with horror for what they represented, which was the shattering of souls for the sake of one reincarnation. But as time went on, things got worse and worse for Adnua. His subjects were suffering tremendously as they were being treated like firewood for his research, and the once loved king was dead to their subjects, for they were forced to live in his shadow, waiting for the day that they were snatched from their homes to be the next subject for an experiment. As the statue was nearing completion, the people began to revolt for their own safety. Armed rebellion swept through the land just as Adnua was putting the final touches on the statue, which culminated in an assault on his fortress by his subjects. Of course, none of these people had seen inside the fortress or even knew what was going on inside of it. They only knew that their kin were being taken and never returned, but they were not prepared for the horrors that they witnessed inside those walls. Some of the animancers that Adnua had kept in his employ didn't fight against people storming through the gates, but opted to save their own skin by letting them into the lower levels, where they would see the statue and Adnua himself. The Children of the Wheel, along with some of the soldiers who were still devoted to Adnua, fought back against the wave of people and struck them down with relative ease, but not before Adnua found himself with a sword in his gut. But he did not die, for before his death he cast a final spell that would envelop him in a case of living Adra, preserving him in his suffering for an eternity. Now, what was the point of telling that story of Adnua? Mostly to serve as an understanding of how far animancy came under his reign, leading to a direct understanding of the soul, where it went when the body died, and how to theoretically get it back and put it into another vessel. This is the beginning of reincarnation in this world, or at least the first step to it. It seems that some feared that in his research, Ardnua was attempting to become a god himself through immortality, and this, of course, sparked a religious war, and not just over ideals, but over the question of do the gods really exist? See, if Ardnua could become a god, then that means that he could challenge the other gods that existed, but since everyone else believed in a different god, that begged the question, whose is real? And who would Ardnua meet if he went up into the heavens? And so, of course, you get a religious war over whose religion is the best religion. This is something that the Engwithans could theoretically answer at this point with further investment into animancy. Like I said, they had already figured out where souls go and how to get them back, so they were essentially playing God themselves, and so the Engwithan animancers devoted all of their energy into a deeper understanding of the gods and who they were worshipping. It took several generations, but they were finally able to reach an answer as to who were the gods that they worshipped, who was the real god, and which of these societies was right. And the answer was a blank page. There were no gods, only myths created by people as a means of comfort and to give meaning into their lives. There existed no deity that was watching over them, or any evidence that there ever was a god. If there was, then they had long since abandoned Eora. And this led to an understandable upset that planted another seed of determination to find out, if there are no gods, then what is the point of existence, and why are souls just being sent into the beyond if they were never intended to go anywhere past that point? Furthermore, why are there no gods, and what would the world look like if they were to attempt to create them to serve as icons and leaders of the new world? The Engwithans were no strangers to religious wars, as I mentioned before, and neither was the entirety of Eora. But now the Engwithans saw that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of false gods that all Kith were so content to destroy themselves in service of. The Engwithans saw it as their duty to create new gods in an effort to stop nonsensical religious wars that were happening every day. If everyone could be united under one real pantheon, then maybe the wars could end and they could finally see world peace. And to do that, the Engwithans were going to have to expand their research. They had all but mastered animancy, and the discovery that there was nothing beyond what was on this earth was distressing, understandably. And so the most that they could hope to achieve was their own goals and create these gods. So they reached out to the Juana Empire of Okaizo, another civilization lost to the annals of time, who were located on the islands surrounding the Deadfire Archipelago. From their capital in Sun and Shadow all the way to the Deadfire Archipelago, the Engwithans, with the help of the Ukaizo people, constructed a vast network of Adra-powered soul machinery to meet their ends. Sun and Shadow was to be the crucible for the creation of a god, for it had one of the largest pillars of living Adra that existed in Eora, while the machinery was to serve as a conduit to take over the wheel, which was the concept for allowing souls to pass from one life to another. The wheel served its purpose much like a river dam, carefully streaming souls from Eora into the beyond, so that they could be reborn into another life, and that was a key component in the creation of the gods. For why were they doing this if not for the works of Ardnua, who seek to bring back his son's soul into this world? If they were to create their own gods, they were going to need a way for them to be able to have a direct link with the souls that they wanted to govern. And so this machine network culminated in a giant machine in Ukaizo, which would serve to tame the wheel and give Engwithans control over the flow of souls through Adra. And, of course, being a pillar to their cause, they needed to make sure that this machine was protected. They treated with 3 great dragons and promised them eternal life in exchange for their eternal protection. This was a monumental task, and one that was not taken lightly, for who would want to live forever if it meant that they were forever in servitude? But the dragons thought that this was a worthy task and accepted the deal. Eternal life for eternal service. But the Engwithans had plans within plans that the Ukaizo knew nothing about. They had granted immortality to the dragons, which now tethered their souls to the machine that would control the wheel, but they had no plans of giving the key of immortality to anyone else. And so, their final act and the culmination of the generations of their society's work was to, in what was a shock to everyone else, sacrifice their entire society to create a god. Most of the Engwithans disappeared in a flash as their soul essence coalesced in the chamber at Sun and Shadow and gave birth to the gods, who were all created out of individual ideals that would help guide the people of Eora. The remaining Engwithans had their own jobs to do as missionaries of the new gods and would travel to all corners of the world spreading word of their new religion. There was one notable Engwithan named Thaus Ix Arcanon, who was named as the steward of the gods and would become Woodica's chosen faithful. Along with being a new leader of this religion on behalf of all Kith, he was also tasked with making sure that no one else knew that the gods were man-made, and to ensure that people across Eora knew that this was the one true religion. The Engwithans now were all either sacrificed to the machine in the creation of their gods or spread thin all over Eora, and they were no longer Engwithans. The ones who still lived did not call themselves Engwithan, and were eventually so spread out that the very concept of Engwith became a legend. Thaus would live over several lifetimes, and is said to have died many times, but always came back into this world immediately with all of his memories intact, and this was because he was the chosen of Woodica, who was the queen of the gods. Over his lifetimes, he created the Leaden Key, which was a secret organization dedicated to the goddess Woodica, and the preservation of the secrets of the gods. However, over time this evolved from a secret society whose intent was to spread the word of God, and discreetly silence anyone who was a danger to the secret of the god's origin, to becoming what I can only describe as a terrorist organization full of extremists who would gladly topple civilizations if they got too close to discovering their secret. This included becoming the enemy of the Animancers, who were the only ones that could potentially see the truth through soul magic. And so the once great society of Animancers turned on their own out of what they saw as a necessity. One of the people who was inducted into the Leaden Key was Eovara Ix Encios, who, when missionaries arrived in her own town, was given hope and was intent on spreading it to everyone in her village. She was a devout servant until one day she overheard one of the priests at the temples talking about the terrible secret that was supposed to have been buried under lock and key, and that was that the gods were created by the Engwithans. Since that day, she began publicly questioning missionaries and calling them out on their deceptions, and gradually led people away from them and their new religion. Thaus, his only real goal being to deliver the new religion unto the people of Eora, could not have this. As people began flocking to Eovara, Thaus began an inquisition which would see Eovara and her followers destroyed. This inquisition was brutal. Once harmless missionaries were turned into torturers and killers, finding these so-called heretics and burning them on pyres in an attempt to have them confess their sins. The goal of this was to make sure that all of Eovara's followers were erased from history, as this was the closest that the god's secret came to being exposed. But it ended up having the opposite effect. As people learned of Eovara and the Inquisition against her, more people flocked to her cause. For every one that was burned on a pyre, 2 more would find themselves replacing them. And eventually this stopped being a simple inquisition to snuff out a heretic flame and turned into a full-blown religious war, the very thing that Thaus and the Engwithans wanted to stop. Eovara ended up falling for a trap set by Thaus and his inquisitors, being led to believe that where she was hiding was a safe haven before she was taken and held as prisoner. She would suffer terrible torture at the hands of Thaus's faithful, and his secret would be kept for the next 2 millennia after the Inquisition managed to root out all of her followers. Although, I wanted to note that she never wavered from her beliefs, no matter how much skin they took from her back, and no matter how hard Thaus's Inquisitors tried. Never did she submit to the Inquisitor's will and go against her heart. She was defiant until the end, and I think that she was one of the few true heroes of her age. Her soul ended up being imprisoned in Adra far below the ground, and she would languish for almost 2,000 years before she was put to rest. In this time, the people of Eora were all converted to their faith, All Kith across the world were worshipping the gods created by the Angwithans, and even if different areas had different names for the gods, they were still the same gods that they followed. And Thaus would live for quite some time yet, and was hellbent on making sure that no one knew their secret. To this end, he destroyed many cities by means of instigating civil wars, supplanting tyrants in place of kings, and even suppressing cures for plagues so that entire civilizations died out if there was even a notion that another Eora Ix Ensios was to rise or animancy started to gain widespread popularity again. There was even a time when Thaus allowed animancy to thrive in the Dyrwood for a time before crushing it. Before he did, though, he would go back to Sun and Shadow to activate the long-dormant Angwithan machines, which denied newborns their souls for around 15 years, and instead directed them to the goddess Wuduka to feed her strength and destabilize the Dyrwood. The Watcher, who was the protagonist of the Two Pillars of Eternity games, would end up being his downfall and would kill him in the end, confronting them at Sun and Shadow where it all began. There's a lot more to that story and how Thaus ended up dying, but that's not so much related to the gods, so go play the games. It will explain everything. But I just wanted to wrap up Thaus' story before we moved on. And I know that this was very long-winded, but that was the creation of the gods. I know I haven't mentioned the gods themselves other than Wuduka at this point, who was integral to the story of Thaus, and I wanted to get to some of their deeds, but there's plenty that happened between the gods, so let's try to find a good place to start. I mentioned way back in Ukaizo that there was a giant machine built, guarded by 3 dragons. And fitted in that machine were 11 large alcoves. These alcoves would be the final resting place of the Titans, giant bodies the Angwithans made of flesh and bone for their gods to inhabit. Initially, when they were created, the gods did indeed inhabit these bodies for a time, and that's how they walked Eora. Again, these gods were Abaddon, Barath, Eothas, Galawain, Hylia, Megran, Andra, Rimmergand, Skane, Whale, and Wuduka. The event that led to them all eventually abandoning their physical bodies was related to the idea of their secret being found out. Eventually, Andra decided that their secret was going to be found out eventually. I mean, it was pretty close to being revealed with the Iovaro Inquisition, and the fact that Angwithan structures and machines still existed, like the one in Sun and Shadow which created them, meant that anyone could find them if they were nosy enough. And that meant that the only way to truly cover up the past was to destroy all evidence of it. You might think that bringing all of your stompy friends over there and just wrecking it might be the answer, but no. The answer that they came up with was to bring down the moon upon the Deadfire Archipelago and the Eastern Reach and just wipe them off the face of the planet. All of the gods except for one, Abaddon, agreed to the measures taken and didn't oppose Andra. But Abaddon, believing in progress and industry and being the god of crafting and the forge, couldn't sit idly by while Andra destroyed parts of Eora just so they could cover up their origin story. And so Abaddon forged a great hammer that he intended to use to shatter the moon before impact, saving the civilizations that were meant to be wiped out. However, one god's titan against the moon was not enough, and Abaddon wasn't able to destroy all the fragments that were raining down on Eora after he threw his hammer at the moon in an attempt to shatter it. So, as a final, last-ditch effort, he shielded Eora from the largest fragment with his body, which was destroyed in the process. And not just his body, but part of his soul was damaged as well. Andra did not intend for this to happen, as she loved Abaddon, and she chalked it up to madness that overcame Abaddon. To honor him and to hide his titan body, she erected the Abbey of the Fallen Moon around his corpse. As well, in an effort to cover up what had happened and to prevent discourse among the other gods, erased memories related to his death and adopted his tools until he was able to come back. Eventually, Abaddon was able to forge a metal body for himself. However, he was not the same as he was before the moon pulverized his face. He lost his will to preserve, the entire reason why he stopped the moon in the first place, and he lost all memories of his demise as well. He became loyal to Megran, the goddess of fire and war, and focused his portfolio on industry, machines, and skilled labor. And in this, Skane grew to resent Abaddon for his passive surrender to authority by following Megran blindly wherever she would lead him. We'll talk more about Skane later, and that will make a lot more sense. But this passive nature is why he was loved as a deity. His worshippers knew that he did not ask anything of them, and he encouraged them to show their devotion by simply learning a new craft or a trade. His presence was that of comfort, especially of the working man who needed to do nothing more than to do a hard day's work to be on the good side of his god. His clergy were all masters in their own craft in things like metalwork or carpentry, and were always happy to teach someone in their trade. As a result of being low maintenance and focused more on self-improvement than anything else, Abaddon ended up being quite popular as a god, despite not necessarily being the most powerful. And I feel like at this time it's worth noting that this wasn't the first time that Andra had some wild machination regarding the moon. Being the goddess of water and the moon, it would make some sense that she revered the moon, but to the degree that she coveted it, it was an odd fascination for sure. There were tales of Andra constantly trying to grasp the moon but failing to grab it as a whole, and only being able to pull down shards at a time, which plummeted into oceans and caused great waves. And this is where people believed that the tides came from, and believed that they're controlled by her fascination with the moon. On a more destructive note, this is also where tsunamis are said to have come from her more forceful attempts. Andra's most notable followers are her gift-bearers, who would take trinkets from those who wanted to send a message to a loved one across the sea and cast them into the depths. And, of course, there is the Abbey of the Fallen Moon built around Abaddon's Titan's corpse, which was largely secretive by nature. It was there that there was two orders, the High and Low Tides. These were those who were most faithful to Andra and were beloved by their god. The High Tide would maintain the day-to-day operations, while the Low Tide would show their dedication by submitting to bouts of slow memory erasure before they were ultimately sacrificed in a cult-like ritual. It's said that those in the Low Tide would grow to resent their decision to commit to Andra in this way, but the erasure of their mind stopped them from leaving their position before they were sacrificed. And that's kind of messed up, and I don't think I want to be part of this cult. Anyways, after this event where Andra called down one of the moons and Abaddon was permanently damaged, the gods decided to abandon their Titan forms. They moved them back to the Great Machine in New Kaizo and set their Titans in their respective alcoves and put them to sleep, all of them returning to the Beyond where they would reign from their metaphysical realm. I would like to think that this is because they realized how dangerous it was for them to be physically present in Eora. The advantages they had over Kith in terms of sheer size and strength, and the power to literally change the world in ways that were never seen before, like pulling a moon from orbit, was a bit too much for Eora, and they would have likely ended up destroying the planet if they had too many more squabbles. The ruins of Anguithan society were not destroyed, as Andra intended, and they remained just that, ruins. However, any surviving Anguithans, now disguised as missionaries, chose to distance themselves from their homeland entirely so that no one would ever have a chance to tie them to it, and the rest is history. Literally. However, only 8 of the 11 Titans returned to their alcoves. Of course, Abaddon was one of those empty voids because his Titan body was sent a UPS Express package straight to their face, but who were the other 2 who chose not to abandon their Titan forms in their rightful places? Oh, and Whale, you'll look at that. Whale was one of the Titans that didn't make it back home. Not for any malicious reason, it seems. From the sounds of it, Whale just abandoned their body beneath the Black Isles where the Hand Occult built the Temple of Revelation atop their corpse, and Whale had simply forgotten about it. Being the god of secrets and revelations, I wonder if there was an alternative purpose for abandoning their Titan form in such a seemingly random place. But I don't know that we'll ever know for sure. But while we're here, let's talk about Whale for a second. Gods of all things mysterious, they are described as a constantly churning mass of eyes and swirls. I don't think I like that at all, and I don't trust that they were up to nothing nefarious with that description. Being the god of secrets and deception, it didn't seem like we knew what their goals were, like we do the other gods. They simply exist with their own devious machinations. Not to say that they were evil or hiding things for nefarious purposes, they just didn't want to share those things with anyone else. Their worshippers tend to pray to Whale to hide things for them or to keep their deep, dark secrets. They are known for committing strange and unusual acts. Again, nothing necessarily nefarious, just strange, and sometimes for no reason at all other than to simply confuse people. The Hand occult is an elite group of Whale's priests who occasionally try to tap into the flow of knowledge itself so that they can limit and rewrite it as they please. To what end, I don't think we'll ever know. Lesser priests and followers of Whale are often seen tending to libraries on the trend of keeping up with places of knowledge. Other than that, we don't know too much about the God of Secrets. But who else's Titan form was not present at Ukaizo? And I would hazard to say it was probably Eothes, and to understand why I think that might be the case, although I didn't see it explicitly mentioned anywhere, we're going to have to go back over a couple of events related to Eothes and his ethos. To understand the god of sun and stars is to understand that the god had a massive ego. Eothes believed that he was the center of all things, and being the god of sun and understanding the sun's importance in the universe, I can understand why he might view himself as the center of the universe. But it was this attitude that put him at odds with the rest of the pantheon. His ego was a bit much for them to handle, and it was a lot for the people of Eora as well. His churches were very strict, unlike the other gods. There were several rules that had to be followed to a T, lest the priests face Eothes' wrath, like keeping candles lit in every room of the temple so that there were no shadows of the unfaithful, or strictly keeping doves in their rookeries while hunting down crows for miles around to keep the purity of the temples intact. Eothes had some very strong opinions on how things should be run, and he was by and far the most strict of the gods in this respect. Among the priests at his church, there was once a man named Waidwin, who allegedly performed a miracle in a colony in the Aedir Empire, just north of the Deerwood, which I think I've mentioned before. Waidwin eventually started amassing followers because of said miracle, and before long there were stories of the miraculous prophet of Eothes. Before being a prophet, Waidwin was a simple farmer with an imagination larger than the fields he worked. His family were devout followers of Eothes, and so he was as well, and he eventually came to start delivering speeches in the town square about his god. People started to notice him day by day and wondered if he was just a madman, because his speeches were just raving and almost incomprehensible, but they listened nonetheless. When questioned about his speeches, he would claim no credit for his speeches, but instead say they were given to him in the night by Eothes himself, and he was only speaking the word of God. One day, while he was working in the fields, it said that Eothes himself took note of the boy and appeared before him offering Waidwin a choice to rebuild an empire, to which Waidwin gleefully accepted. According to Eothes, the people of Red Saris were being punished for their lack of piety and their loyalty to their Aediran governor. He believed that their devotion was geared more towards their government than it was their religion, and Eothes was nothing if not jealous. And so he had Waidwin continue his speeches. He gained so much traction that one day during a speech he was seized by imperial guards and restrained, being accused of crimes such as animancy, public indecency, cruelty to children, and even having a venereal disease, which I didn't know was a crime, but the Aedirans never really made much sense anyways. I think these accusations were more to shame Waidwin and hopefully persuade people away from the alleged deviant. For his crimes, he was ordered 30 lashes in front of the crowd that he was speaking to. Waidwin took them with a smile on his face, and even though the crowd protested against his punishment, Waidwin encouraged his aggressors to carry it out in full. He never made so much as a peep as the whip came down upon him, which clearly had an effect on the guards who, after only the 5th lashing, had to consult on whether or not to continue with the punishment, but they were told to regardless. With each lashing, the wound opened up into a brilliant light that shone from his body. The guards, again, questioned whether or not they should continue, but Waidwen encouraged them to carry out his punishment in a voice that people described as not being his own. It's theorized that maybe this was Aethys himself speaking through Waidwen. As the guard brought down the 30th lashing, Waidwen's body erupted into a pillar of light, and a crown of flames bore down on his brow. He then stood up on the dais as his chain restraints melted off of him in molten pieces, and with the unwavering attention of everyone in the square, he finished his speech that was so rudely interrupted. He finished his speech by inciting the people to rise up against their leadership as pilgrims of Aethys and to deliver unto them the bloody will of the divine. And this was the miracle that Waidwen performed, and was known to most as the miracle of the Verdant Vorious. And I mean, after exploding into a being of light, you can see why he amassed so many followers so quickly and became a prophet to the people. Over the next coming days, his followers grew exponentially, and he was able to take his pilgrims to confront the governor in the capital city. When he entered the governor's place, it's said that Waidwen's body once again erupted into light and turned into something that was no longer human. With luminescent flesh and a head that was simply a blinding light, the government knew that he had no power here anymore, and he was not willing to attempt an attack on the chosen of Aethys, so he relinquished his power to Waidwen, who led the colony with the title of Divine King of Red Saris. This reign was virtually uncontested, as the faithful believed that this was no longer a simple preacher, but thought that it might be Aethys himself that had come down from the heavens to lead his people. However, this would not last forever, as the Divine King started to enforce his will with an iron fist, pushing out members of the clergy who he claimed had poisoned the well, and he started persecuting former allies and citizens who worshipped gods other than Aethys. And anyone who dared say a word against the Divine King, regardless if they were a faithful of Aethys or not, were declared heretics, and no quarter was held against their detention. These actions led to people fleeing from Red Saris to the Dyrwood for sanctuary from the mad god. However, the Dyrwood didn't have the infrastructure to deal with the exponential population growth, and so they knew they had to do something about the Divine King's unchecked power before their society collapsed under its own weight. And the final straw was when Waidwen started to shift his attention to the Dyrwood and the heretics that resided there, and that's when they knew that there was no recourse except for war. And this was known later as the Saints' War, which Waidwen personally participated in, becoming known for being virtually untouchable on the battlefield as people started to really wonder if they were fighting against Aethys himself, as he emitted beams of blinding light which disintegrated his foes. Because of this terror, it seemed as though he might actually be indestructible, potentially having a god inside of him, and so he ended up being the most feared on the battlefield, while also being the leader and instigator of this war. On top of that, he led several successful campaigns against the White March Mountains and the Cold Morn despite overwhelming odds, and sacked Mercy Vale, which left Dyrwood in a bad way. It wasn't looking good for the people of Dyrwood, and it looked like Waidwen was going to push through them with abject ease until the Battle of Halgot Citadel, where they knew they had to put it all on the line, for they knew that if they didn't at least slow down Waidwen, then they were doomed. But they realized that they couldn't just fight him head on. They had been trying that for days and nothing had succeeded, so they needed to turn to some more underhanded tactics. They figured that if they couldn't face him directly, they could at least cause enough chaos to catch him by surprise and, hopefully, off guard, gaining the advantage. And so they worked on a device, a bomb, that was 12 feet in diameter and filled with all the explosives you could possibly shove in there. The bomb was the work of countless engineers and priests of Magran working in secret, and some say that the goddess of fire and war, Magran herself, was colluding with her priests and helping them make the bomb directly, under advisement from Woedica, in hopes that they could create a weapon that could kill a god. They had to work under the assumption that Waidwen was Aethys himself and not just a chosen kith, because if they used anything other than a full measure, there was the potential that it just wouldn't be enough. So they prepared for the worst. The bomb itself was, as you might imagine by how large it was, probably overkill. Following his wake, they figured the best place to plot an ambush in his path was going to be at the Evendir Bridge, where they stationed 12 people that would serve as bait to lead Waidwin onto the bridge and keep him busy so they could detonate the bomb and ensure that he was still on the bridge at that time. The bomb itself was placed under the bridge in the foundation where they had excavated a hole large enough to tuck it in, and all they had to do now was wait. And thankfully, it paid off. Waidwin, along with 50 of his soldiers, were blown up in the explosion and were promptly set to the wheel. Unfortunately, 8 of the 12 Deerwood soldiers that were stationed as a distraction died as well, but it was deemed a worthy sacrifice to stop Waidwin and his goons from taking over the Deerwood entirely. And it was at this moment, when Waidwin was killed, that the Saints' War was officially declared over. Without their divine king, the rest of the Red Saris soldiers were easily routed or had fled the battlefield, and Deerwood was safe from the invasion. The bomb went down in history as Godhammer, and would be used in everyday conversation like, "As sure as the Godhammer ended the Saints' War," and other cutesy phrases to express abject certainty. The result of this war was that the followers of Aethys were persecuted by the folks of the Deerwood, just as their people were persecuted by Waidwin, and the worship of Aethys came to a grinding halt. Those who did worship him would pray in secret, as his clergy had become sort of a symbol of anti-Kith and anti-God behavior. It was seen as disruptive and destructive as Waidwin and the Saints' War that he led, and so it became heretical to even mention the name Aethys without cursing him in the same breath. But what about Aethys himself? Well, I think that most people believed Waidwin had stopped existing and that the Divine King was indeed just Aethys himself. That would mean that the Godhammer was a god killer in the end, but we know that from the story of Abaddon that it seems that the gods are never truly dead, just inconvenienced until they come back. To that end, the people who prayed to Aethys in secret didn't hear from their god, even though he was very vocal before this, as per his egotistical nature. And even though the body of Waidwin, or Aethys if you believe it was him, was never found, it was largely assumed that he was dead. As for the priests and engineers that worked on the bomb, Magrin took care of them, and not in the, "you did a great job, here's a lollipop" kind of way, but in a, "we can never do this again" sort of way, and they were assumedly killed by their god for ushering in a weapon that could potentially be created to kill another god, as a means to bury the recipe in hopes that another Godhammer was never made. Even though she was personally involved, whether it was at the goading of Woedica or not, Magran and the other gods could not have the information of how to build a god killer in the world. And speaking of Magran and her followers, let's take a brief intermission to talk about her and her followers. She herself was depicted as a large, fierce, fiery woman who was heavily armored and wielded a greatsword. Like I mentioned before, she was the goddess of fire and war, but unlike most gods of war, she was not a god that relished in the act of war itself or glorified the act, but rather, she was a god that celebrated military excellence and discipline. She did not have a lust for battle, but rather a vested interest in the tradition that surrounds war. However, that doesn't mean that her followers felt the same way. Many of them thought that adversity was necessary for growth and that there was no better trial than the stage of war. Her more extreme followers would go around dispensing justice as they saw fit, which was usually just an excuse to beat down on people who were weaker than they were. So, while I wouldn't say that Magran herself was an evil deity, her followers could be very easily compelled to do evil acts. Alright, back to the shenanigans. Around 20 years later or so, Aethys had gained enough strength to take control of a giant statue of Maris Nua in the Deerwood. The act of taking over the statue itself was so destructive that over 300 people in the nearby area perished as a result. Aethys then marched across the ocean to the Deadfire Archipelago, where he sought the lost city of Ukaizo and the machine that the Anguithans built thousands of years prior. And that couldn't go unanswered by the other gods. Aethys was already vilified by the other gods for his involvement in the Saints' War, which led to unnecessary wanton destruction, and so taking over a statue and marching towards the place where the machine that harnessed the wheel was being kept was something that they could just not abide by. But tried as they might to stop Aethys, they were not successful, and he was able to eventually make his way to the lost city of Ukaizo. His goal, as I alluded to, was to destroy the ancient Ingwithan machine and break the wheel. But why? Well, the fact that the Ingwithan machine had been put into place to tame the wheel and control the flow of souls into a cycle of afterlife and rebirth, and the gods had been created, Bereth in particular, to that end, and had been in that state for a couple thousand years, meant that the process was so tied to the gods that it could probably never go back to its original state, if something were to happen to them. To very quickly play devil's advocate, you could see Aethys' quest to break the wheel as an act of benevolence, as he was simply trying to restore the state of the Beyond to what it was before there was anything tangible in place to control it. After all, the world had worked just fine before the gods were created, and if you look at it from a certain point of view, the gods' involvement in the wheel was unnatural. And maybe Aethys just wanted to put the world back into its natural state of being and create less of a dependence on the gods. And while it's true that I think he did want to foster an environment where the gods were not relied on as much, I don't think that this was truly an act of benevolence, but one of self-interest. See, Aethys had just been revived after having his avatar nuked by the Godhammer bomb. That bomb, I'm sure he knew, was only created with the help of the gods Woedica and Magran, and so he had every right to be angry at his kin, and so this was a very straight-to-the-point, no-frills revenge plot. Simply, he wanted to elevate the Kith in Eora to a position where they didn't need the gods, or at least not other ones. Aethys made it very clear that he's willing to personally interfere in the lives of Kith in order to bring himself more power. And so, I'm sure that this was partially in the interest of making them reliant on only him instead of the rest of the Pantheon. And to do that, he had to break the wheel and therefore diminish the power that the gods held over Kith. And so he did. He marched on the machine and with massive fists struck blows at the machine until it sputtered out and it was no more, breaking the wheel and stopping the flow of souls in the Beyond from reincarnation. He believed that it would force them all to face a certain truth that they would either fall together in the wake of this event or move forward and become stronger. He felt that breaking the wheel was preferable to the endless cycle that they had grown used to. And that pretty much catches us up to Avowed, or at least a few years before the Envoy sets foot on the Living Lands. Or, at the very least, the more notable events. But what happened to Aethys? He destroyed the machine at Ukaizo, disrupted the wheel, assumedly siphoned all of the souls from the wheel into himself to sustain his form, but we learn in Avowed, which takes place only 3 years after this happened, that Aethys is still not talking to his followers. And I don't want to go into too many spoilers for a certain side quest in Avowed, but Aethys no longer has his Titan form. It doesn't really seem like he has any more power than other gods, and the wheel is just in a state of disarray. But that leaves us having only talked about Abaddon, Magran, Andra, Whale, and Aethys. That leaves us with 6 other Ingwithan deities to go over, so I figure let's just do all of that now. Before this point, I was trying to tie them all into the story, and then I realized that half of them aren't even really involved in the story itself, so we might as well just start going alphabetically and go Bereth, Galawain, Hylia, Rimmergand, Skane, and Woedica. I know we've mentioned Woedica several times now, but we'll get a more in-depth look at her here. We've also mentioned Bereth, the god of cycles, doors, life, and death before, who is responsible for the wheel and the cycle of reincarnation. They are an interesting god because, while most other gods have a defined gender that they prefer to present as, Bereth does not. They either present as a genderless figure or a twin male-female incarnation. Maybe it's because they feel like they serve all Kith, and that no one form is better than the other. It's not really said why this is, but I would argue that Bereth is maybe the most important god in the entire pantheon, being responsible for reincarnation, as the topic of reincarnation was really the entire reason why the gods were created in the first place. Bereth's priests were expected to be relatively emotionless and rational, considering they are to deal with matters of death with dignity, as their god wills it. And if you've kept up with my explanations of the Dungeons & Dragons pantheon, you'll know that the gods of death are seldom the most popular because death is something that pretty well everyone fears and tries to avoid. Barath seems to understand this, but encourages people to search for the duality of life and death that exists in all things. And if you can embrace this duality, then you are within their good graces. Because of the nature of their portfolio, Barath has a relatively small clergy, but this is also in part because Barath chooses not to speak to their faithful very often, if at all. As we learned with Aethys, people prefer to tend to God who feels like they're present in the world and care about their followers, and as soon as communications stop, there tends to be a trend of faith falling off as well. Regardless, those who serve faithfully, and while they're generally feared by most people, representing death and all of the doom and gloom surrounding it, they are also respected for their level-headedness and unflinching resolve in the face of death and suffering. Galawain is the god of the hunt and protector of wild places and untamed wilderness. He is also occasionally referred to as the father of monsters because of his tendency to create new creatures and let them loose upon Eora. This could be anything from a new predator to an elusive white stag that, if someone were to successfully hunt it, they would forever gain his favor. In this fashion, Galawain prefers that his faithful are perseverant, clever, and have a strong will to survive despite overwhelming odds. There isn't much to be said about the clergy of Galawain, if one even exists, but those who follow him tend to have their own traditions that they follow. One such tradition is held for the Glanfathan clans who, when their leaders pass away, their body will be taken into a forest. If their body is left intact from scavengers, then they take that as faith that their leader's soul has been accepted by Galawain and that they have joined his hunting pack. If it was eaten by scavengers, however, then it is assumed that their role as leader was illegitimate, their soul having been abandoned by Galawain and left to find their own way to the wheel, and would have their names stricken from their oral records. And even though Galawain was the god of the hunt, and you might associate him with just hunters, trackers, that sort of thing, interestingly enough, some assassins even take Galawain as their patron god for what is assassination but hunting prey? A bit of a morbid thought, but interesting nonetheless. Hylia is the goddess of birds, the sky, childbirth, and creative inspiration. She often appears to be wrapped in a mantle of birds, and is thought to use birds as her ears and eyes in Eora. Her temples are usually full of tall windows with skylights and aviaries, as you might expect. The Church of Hylia seems to be a very laid-back one with an informal clergy full of country bumpkin midwives who show their devotion to their goddess by wearing charms of colorful feathers. Other followers of Hylia, like artists, might keep birds in their homes in hopes of catching a font of creativity from their goddess. There isn't really much else to say about Hylia, unfortunately, except that apparently the Orlens attempted to capture inspiration by hunting exotic birds and then eating them. This act was understandably frowned upon by Hylia, and she is said to have cursed these people with painful childbirth as a result. Rimmergand is the god of erosion and collapse mainly, which takes the form of death, plague, or simply bad luck, and he's known as the Beast of Winter. But why the Beast of Winter? Well, being the god of collapse and erosion, he tends to represent entropy and the end state of all things, and people associate him to the winter season where everything has died, nothing can grow, and is generally pretty sterile and lifeless. He's also thought to be one of the oldest gods, with depictions of Rimmergand being found in even the oldest of Engwithan ruins, and is interesting in the fact that he's one of the few gods who didn't present themselves as humanoid. Rather, Rimmergand presents himself as a large oryx with albino fur that is encrusted with ice and snow. And as massive as it is, it seems as though it's been starved and is rather cadaverous in appearance and kills everything in its wake. A cold wind follows behind them, and every footprint leaves behind withered leaves and grass. And you might be thinking, isn't Barath also the god of death? How do they get along? And the answer is that they have a very complicated relationship due to their overlapping portfolios. However, Rimmergand isn't actually the god of death, but rather his portfolio of erosion is often interpreted as death. So you could kind of see them in this way. Rimmergand pulls the lever to the gallows, and Barath is the one who takes the body down and throws them into the cart. Barroth determines what happens to the soul after they die, and Rimmergand is more associated with the act of death itself. So, Barroth is the true god of death, ushering souls into the afterlife. But Rimmergand is kind of just the act of death because of erosion. Being associated with the act of death, followers of Rimmergand tend to believe that resurrection is an abominable concept, and saw it as a punishment rather than a blessing, contradictory to pretty much every other worship. I wonder if this is in part because Barroth, who is largely responsible for reincarnation, is more notably seen as the god of death, and Rimmergand's worshippers see only Rimmergand as the true god of death, and therefore shun the concepts that Barroth stands for, which is reincarnation. I have nothing to back up that little thought, but I just thought it was interesting. Skane is the god of secret hatred, resentment, and violent rebellion, and is often referred to as the quiet slave. Seen as a small, cowering, bald man covered in lash marks with deep, black eyes filled with hatred, Skane is known to summon into existence a creature called an effigy to his worshippers who are desperate and willing to commit unspeakable acts. An effigy is basically a withered humanoid creature, which is born of a worshipper who is shaved, has all representation of gender removed, has their nose and ears cut off and eyes gouged out and replaced with black stones that are reminiscent of the eyes of their god. And then, to complete the transformation, the effigy must drink every last drop of blood from a wealthy or highborn person. And if you don't think that's messed up, I don't know what is. The effigy could do a number of things, but the most recent example of an effigy sighting is one where an effigy was summoned to lead a peasant rebellion during which an entire noble family was captured, flayed, and nailed to the roof of their estate, where they would be devoured by birds and flies while they were still alive. And you might be thinking that surely to rise up against an oppressive force, they didn't need to mutilate someone as an effigy in order to do so, but the benefit to having an effigy on your side is that they would stop at literally nothing until their target was dead, and they will do so effectively because Skane themselves makes themselves personally present in the effigy. So they stop being the person they were before they were mutilated, and the effigy becomes Skane physically incarnated. Similar, I guess, to how Aethys took over Waidwen. Skane typically tends to represent a violent rise against oppression, which, obviously, doesn't make him a very popular god to worship. In fact, those who worship him have to do in secret because there are no temples dedicated to Skane, and therefore no official clergy. This is likely because anyone ruling a city or town would see a temple of Skane as a threat to their authority, knowing how Skane treats the rich and powerful. And while dismantling the oligarchy is his mantra, he doesn't tend to take sides in warfare or against colonial forces because he doesn't want to interfere too much and cause the scales of power to tip in the favor of one nation or another. For that reason, effigies are typically a fairly rare sighting, and even if people attempt to make an effigy, there isn't a guarantee that it will work, as Skane has the final say whether or not he wants to fight a certain fight. Boudica is the goddess of law, justice, oaths, and promises, and is known as the Burned Queen, Oathbinder, and the Strangler. We've talked about her a bit already and how she was chosen to be the leader of the gods by the Angwithans since she was supposed to be the patron deity of law and order. Of course, this seemed like a good plan, but Boudica was just power-hungry and was totally willing to ignore her own rules if it served her own means. This is why, despite being the de facto leader of the gods, she was ultimately hated by most of the other gods, and even the gods who didn't hate her had a begrudging working relationship with her. This led to her exile, which brought her on even footing with the rest of the gods. This is where we get the title of Burned Queen, because she was cast down from her throne by the goddess of war and fire, Megran. Priestesses of Boudica serve as lawyers and judges, and the most prominent among them are advisors to kings and other notable political figures. With this being the case, her worshippers tend to be in the upper class, which begs the question, why is it that the only god who works with her is Skane, who despises the rich and powerful? We don't exactly know the details of their relationships. I just find it odd that the god who is responsible for dethroning the wealthy also serves the former queen of the gods and the representation of the wealthy and powerful. If you're currently playing through Avowed, then the best example of the kind of people who follow Boudica are the Adiran paladins known as the Steel Garrote. These are a group of ruthless warriors who work on behalf of the Adirian Empire to bring peace, freedom, justice, and security to their empire through any means necessary, and are personally responsible for the slaughter of countless innocents in the name of achieving that end. So, it seems that justice is just as corrupt on Eora as it was in the Pantheon. And that about does it for the explanation of the gods. We've talked about their ideals, their followers, their involvement in shaping Eora, but there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the godlikes. This isn't a new pantheon of gods, but rather the Kith who were blessed by the gods in one way or another. These Kith are born with aspects of the god who gave them their blessing, and, depending on the civilization they lived in, are either welcomed as the embodiment of a god or shunned as an outcast and abomination. There are 9 different types of godlike, which I find interesting because there are 12 gods, but I think that's because there's some overlap in the different kinds of godlikes, meaning that different aspects of different gods overlap with each other, and so the godlikes of Sapadal and Galawain would both be under the nature type. But speaking of the types, those types would be death, fire, moon, nature, avian, endings, marine, dawn, and Skane godlikes. Skane gets his own thing for some reason. Any race of Kith can be born as a godlike, and like I mentioned before, they would have some sort of physical aspect that sets them apart as a godlike. The type of physical attribute differed from godlike to godlike depending on who blessed them. For example, avian godlikes would have feathers growing on their face that would lead up into their hair. A nature godlike might have the ears and nose of a doe and antlers, like a sort of satyr. Fire godlikes would have devilish horns, blackened skin, and a head of fire instead of hair, while a marine godlike might have tentacles instead of hair and scales adorning their face. There are plenty of different kinds, but the mark of a godlike is always very apparent and sets them apart from a crowd. Godlikes are very rare, however. They don't appear too often, which is why seeing one can often produce shock to others because of their rarity. And in tandem with rarity, godlikes also can't reproduce. This means that 2 godlikes wouldn't be able to have a child and sire another godlike. And even if they could have a child, I don't think it would necessarily be a godlike, because that attribute isn't given out randomly through the genetic lottery, but godlikes are handpicked by each of the gods. But because they cannot have heirs, people generally see them as sexless or genderless beings, regardless of how they self-identify. And this can and has caused legal problems that require someone to state a gender, as you might imagine. If the government doesn't recognize a gender, then you either don't exist to them, or you are whatever they say you are, and I don't need to draw parallels to the real world to tell you how messed up that is. So, there is a potential benefit to being a godlike if you're somewhere where they are seen as a boon from the gods, but honestly it seems like kind of a drag. More times than not, you're going to be seen as not being cut from the same cloth as everyone else and pushed out of most circles. Because of this and not being able to reproduce, many godlikes don't tend to form long-lasting relationships or get married because they're seen as simply too different from normal folk. It seems that they tend to be adventurers more often than not. Aside from godlikes, I know that I mentioned Sapadal at the beginning and just there, and I introduced them as the god of the living lands, and it might seem strange that I didn't include them in with the other gods, but I wanted to save Sapadal to the end for this reason. It's hard to say exactly who they are and what their values are, because who and what they are is largely up to the character to decide in Avowed. All of your interactions with them are dialogue-driven, and they will react to the dialogue choices you make, meaning that they're very different depending on how you treat them as the player character. If you're a long-time listener, you know that I don't tend to cover things that aren't rooted in fact, and I tend to just give broad strokes when it comes to concepts that are driven by the character experience. The other gods are pretty well explained, and all of the things I've mentioned about them are seen as facts in Eora. The creation of the gods, the exile of Woedica, the saints' war effigies bringing noble families down, these are all things that have happened in the history of Eora. Pretty well everything that happens in relation to Sapadal is up to the character to decide, and there's plenty left up for interpretation, and so I don't feel that I can confidently say what they are all about, and I don't feel comfortable giving a history on them as it's largely theoretical and subjective. Or at least some of it is. I don't want to say that it all is, because there are certain things that are rooted in fact. But that being said, there is a ton of nuance within Avowed related to Sappadal. And if you've made it this far and haven't played Avowed, then I would urge you to, especially if you're a fan of the Pillars of Eternity games. It's a great RPG that is largely dialogue focused, with most of the gameplay being combat based. There's a ton of lore in there about the other gods, and the story of Sappadal that you can experience through the campaign is great, and that's because it can change so drastically from playthrough to playthrough. And so, long story short, I won't be talking about Sappadal in this episode. I know that might disappoint someone, but if I do, then I'll be talking about them in their own episode, because there's an entire game dedicated to their lore specifically, whereas the Pillars games are focusing on all 11 gods at once. And considering this episode is running longer than I think I anticipated, I ended up writing 12,000 words for this thing, I think that leaving them to their own episode is the right call. If you want to hear about Sappadal, though, please let me know. I can try to put something together in the future. But that brings me to my favorite question, which is, what do you think? Do you think that the Engwithans were right to create the gods? How do you think the world would be different if they hadn't created them? Or a more topical question is, if you've played Avowed, did you like it? I know there has been some criticism regarding the game, but as of recording this episode, I just finished this less than 12 hours ago, and I thought that the game was incredible. If you like Obsidian games and you liked the Outer Worlds, I don't see why you wouldn't like Avowed. I know I've spoken out against review bombing before, and I think that it's worth stating again that just because some critic was paid to say that this game was garbage, doesn't mean that you should listen to them and not play the game. If a game intrigues you, play it regardless of what other people think and form your own opinion. I promise you'll find a lot more interesting content that way. You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so if you head over there and hit subscribe, I would really appreciate it. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me, or at lordtodeath@gmail.com, all one word. If you're using the Spotify app, there is a comment section attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. If you're on YouTube, then you know what to do. Leave a comment. I would really love to hear from you. And remember, whether you're growing fungus on your face or you have devil horns and fire for hair, it's what's on the inside that counts. Lungs, a liver, 2 kidneys. These all have a very high price on the black market, and with the rising price of eggs, you might have to consider donating some organs to a strange man in the alley between Jersey Mike's and Domino's. His knife may be rusty, his smile crooked, and his enthusiasm for your kidney might be a little bit much, but if you want that avocado toast, you know what you have to do. And I will lure you to death in the next one. See ya.